Imagine for a second you're the CEO of a massive legacy organization. I mean, we're talking too big to fail territory.
Okay.
You have over 1 million customers, you oversee thousands of employees, billions in infrastructure, sprawling campuses, fleets of vehicles, huge pension obligations. You are the biggest game in town.
Sounds like a pretty secure position to be in.
It does, right.
Yeah.
But now, imagine this scenario. Almost overnight, 35% of those customers just walk out the door.
35%.
They leave, they take all the funding attached to them, and they promise they are never coming back. So here's the million-dollar question. How long does your organization survive? 10 years? A decade? Do you just downsize and keep on trucking?
Well, the intuitive answer, and certainly the one most bureaucrats would give, is, well, we'd just shrink.
Right.
We'd cut our costs by 35%, tighten the belt, and just carry on as a smaller version of ourselves.
That is the intuitive answer. It is also, according to the simulation we're covering today, completely and catastrophically wrong.
It's mathematically impossible in this specific context.
Today, we are doing a deep dive into this fascinating and honestly kind of terrifying piece of economic modeling. It's titled Breaking the P-12 Racket.
Right.
And it analyzes the Washington State public school system running this exact stress test. What happens if 35% of students leave the system permanently?
And the answer the model gives isn't 10 years. It implies the entire system collapses, functionally fails, in about 3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 years. That's basically the time it takes for a high school freshman to graduate.
Exactly.
So if you start high school when this exodus begins, there might not even be a school system left by the time you get your diploma.
It's incredibly fast. And, before we get into the weeds, I think it's important to state our mission here. We're setting aside the politics.
Strictly.
I know education is a huge culture war battleground, but this document, it's an exercise in actuarial math. This is a lesson in what's called systemic insolvency. We just want to understand how a massive institution can fall off a cliff when the numbers stop adding up.
Which is a concept I think we need to define right at the top. We assume public institutions are these unshakable pillars. They're backed by the government. They can't go bankrupt, like, I don't know, Blockbuster Video or some startup that ran out of cash. But this model says otherwise.
Right. It suggests that insolvency for a public system looks different than a corporate bankruptcy, but the result is the same. The machinery stops working.
You can't pay the bills.
You can't pay the bills. You can't honor your contracts, and the service just halts.
So let's look at that machine. Walk us through the baseline. What does this model look like before the chaos starts?
So to run any simulation, you need a control group. The source material starts by establishing the current state of Washington's P-12 education.
Okay.
We're dealing with a total enrollment of approximately 1,100,000 students. In the math, that's our starting population, what they call N dollars a letter.
1.1 million kids. That's not just a number, that's the population of a major city. It's a massive logistical operation.
It is. And the model assumes a status quo budget structure. This part is crucial to understand.
What does that mean exactly?
It means it assumes the way schools are funded, the way they hold debt, and especially the way they employ people, stays consistent with current laws and contracts. It doesn't assume the system magically becomes more efficient just because it needs to.
So it assumes the bureaucracy acts like a bureaucracy.
Exactly. It assumes rigidity.
Okay, so we've got the baseline. Now let's introduce the variable. What's the thing that throws this whole system into a tailspin?
The model calls this variable dollar, which is the withdrawal fraction.
Okay.
The specific premise used in the text, and again, this is just the data input for the model, is that roughly 35% of students come from conservative families. The what-if scenario is that all of those parents decide to withdraw their children from the public system permanently.
So we equals bureau 35.
Exactly. That's the trigger.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Is that realistic? 35% of people just up and leaving a free service?
It's a huge number.
It seems staggering for a simulation. Most people can't afford private school, and homeschooling is really hard.
It is a staggering number. And in modeling terms, you'd call this a corner case or a maximum stress test.
Okay.
Whether they leave because of ideology or curriculum or because they're all moving to a colony on Mars doesn't actually matter for the math.
Right.
The model is just asking, what is the breaking point? And it uses this demographic block as the mechanism to find that break. It's testing the structural integrity of the hull by simulating a massive breach.
Okay, so for the sake of the argument, we accept the input. 35% of the customers, they just vanish. Enrollment drops to 65% of the original, basically overnight.
And because Washington state funding, like almost all public school funding in the U.S., is tied directly to enrollment, the revenue drops by about 35%.
Almost immediately.
Instantly.
Okay, so this brings us to the core friction. And I want to spend some real time here because this is the part that just defies intuition.
It really does.
If I'm running a coffee shop and I sell 35% less coffee, I just buy 35% fewer beans. I schedule 35% fewer shifts. I might make less profit, but I don't go out of business.
Right.
Why can't a school district just do that? Why is this a collapse and not just a budget cut?
That question is the trap. That is where this idea of the structural deficit comes in. The source material spends a lot of time on this difference between linear revenue and step function costs.
Let's break those down. Linear revenue sounds pretty straightforward.
It is. Revenue is linear. One kid leaves, the state takes back the per-pupil funding for that kid. Let's just say it's $15,000. It's a straight line down. 10 kids leave, you lose $150,000.
Simple math.
But the costs are sticky, they're fixed, or they move in big steps.
Give me a concrete example.
Buildings. That's the easy one. If a high school is designed for 2,000 kids and now only 1,300 show up, you can't turn off the heat in 35% of the hallways.
Right.
You can't repair 35% less of the roof. You still have to mow the entire football field.
Yeah.
And the debt service on that building, the mortgage, basically, that's totally fixed.
Okay, physical plant makes sense, but labor is the biggest cost, right? Teachers, staff. Surely you can fire teachers. Fewer kids means you need fewer classes.
You can,
Yeah.
but not linearly and not right away. This is where reverse economies of scale kick in. Let's say you have a third grade class with 25 kids.
Yeah.
5 of them leave. Now you have 20 kids.
Okay.
You still need one teacher. You still need one classroom. Your revenue for that class just dropped 20%, but your cost dropped 0%.
You're paying full price for a product you're selling at a discount.
Exactly. You can't fire 20% of a teacher.
Yeah.
And then you scale that up to the administration.
Oh.
You still need a superintendent. You still need an HR department, a bus dispatcher. You can't fire 35% of a payroll clerk. This is the overhead that crushes you when volume drops.
This central office doesn't shrink just because the classrooms are emptier?
Not at all. And the source also mentions legacy costs. This sounded like the most dangerous part to me because it's money you owe for things that already happened.
It is the invisible killer. We're talking pensions and debt.
Okay, explain the pension trap. I feel like people hear pension and their eyes glaze over, but this seems critical. It's the engine of the insolvency. Public pensions are often funded by current contributions paying for past retirees. It's a delicate actuarial balance.
So if you suddenly slash your workforce to try and save money, say you do manage to fire a bunch of teachers.
You now have fewer active employees paying into the system.
But the number of retirees collecting their checks hasn't changed.
Correct. And that obligation to the retirees is constitutionally protected. So you create a massive shortfall in the pension fund, and the district still has to make up that difference by raising contribution rates on the remaining budget. So your labor costs per person actually go up, even as you're trying to cut staff.
And what of the debt? The bonds.
School districts issue bonds to build those nice new schools. Those are legal contracts with banks, with investors.
And the bank doesn't care that your enrollment is down.
The bank wants their coupon payment every 6 months. If you miss it, you are in default.
So the argument is, revenue falls off a cliff, but the costs float down gently like a feather.
And the gap between that cliff and the feather is the deficit. And in this model, that gap is so wide that it consumes all your available resources almost instantly.
Okay, let's get to the timeline. Because you said 3 to 5 years. Usually government things take 20 years to fall apart. We see underfunded systems limp along for decades. How does this happen so fast?
The model breaks down by years, measuring what it calls the burn rate.
Walk us through year 1. The conservative families pull their kids out, September rolls around.
Year 1 is the shock. The students just don't show up. The October count, which is usually when the state funding is finalized, comes in disastrously low. The district immediately hits a massive deficit.
But they have savings, right? A rainy day fund.
They do, reserves. The source labels them as assets or buyer dollars. But here's the math problem. Reserves are usually meant to cover maybe a 5 or 10% budget shortfall for a short time, like a recession.
We're talking about a 35% revenue shortfall.
Exactly. The model shows that at a withdrawal rate, that $2.25, those reserves are incinerated in the first 12 to 18 months.
So by the time they even realize the magnitude of what's happening, the savings account is already at zero.
It's gone. And this is where the tipping point concept from the text is so fascinating. It argues there's a threshold right around y equals 0.3 where the system loses its ability to stabilize itself.
So below 30%, maybe you can survive?
Maybe. You can cut programs, delay maintenance, increase class sizes, and limp along. But above 30%, the spiral becomes self-reinforcing.
Because to save money, you have to degrade the quality of the school itself.
Exactly. You cut sports, you fire the popular art teacher, you stop bus service to some areas, you let the roof leak.
Which just makes more parents want to leave, even the ones who weren't part of the original 35%.
Correct. It actually increases dollars. It becomes a feedback loop. But let's stick to the financial mechanics. Years 2 and 3 are where the covenants come into play. This is the technical stuff that usually puts people to sleep, but it's actually the trigger for the explosion.
I highlighted financial covenants. Break that down for us non-economists. Why do these matter so much?
So when a district borrows money, they sign a contract with the bondholders. That contract has what are called coverage ratios.
Okay.
It says, essentially, we promise our revenue will always be at least 1.2 times our debt payments. It's a safety buffer. When your revenue drops 35%, you violate that covenant.
You're legally in breach of contract.
Yes, which means the banks can call the debt, or at the very least, your credit rating tanks to junk status.
What does junk status mean for a school district?
It means you can no longer borrow money to flow payroll. Most districts use short-term loans to pay teachers while they wait for tax revenue to come in.
And if your credit is junk...
Nobody lends to you. You are cash flow insolvent.
And this is all happening while you still have a constitutional duty to educate the 65% of kids who stayed.
That's the paradox.
Yeah.
The law says you must provide special education, you must provide transportation, you must maintain certain facility standards, but the bank account says zero.
So you're caught between a judge ordering you to provide services and a banker refusing to cash your checks.
That is the definition of collapse in this model.
Yeah.
It's not that the buildings burn down. It's that the entire legal and financial architecture just locks up. You literally cannot write the checks to keep the lights on.
The source uses the phrase systemic insolvency. It really distinguishes this from just having a tight budget.
Right. A tight budget is, we can't afford new iPads this year. Insolvency is, we can't make payroll on Friday. The model predicts that for the statewide system, this leads to a functional collapse within 3 to 5 years. The probability they list for this outcome is about 99.9%.
A statistical certainty.
In this specific model, assuming those inputs, yes.
Let's visualize this. The listener is wondering, what does this actually look like on the ground? It's year 3, the money is gone, the credit is junk. What happens to the schools in my neighborhood?
The text describes it as waves of failure. And the first wave is massive consolidation. It's ugly.
Mergers.
Forced mergers. You have to close schools immediately to try and get those fixed costs down. So you're taking 3 partially empty high schools and cramming them into 2. You're closing neighborhood elementary schools and busing kids 45 minutes away.
Communities hate that. That sounds like political suicide for any school board.
It is. It tears communities apart.
Yeah.
Parents protest. Property values drop because the local school closed. It creates chaos. Then comes a labor crisis. To survive, the model says districts would have to break union contracts. They'd have to lay off tenured staff, ignore class size caps, cut benefits.
Which would lead to strikes.
Massive strikes, lawsuits, injunctions. You end up with a system that is consuming all its energy just fighting for survival, fighting the bank, fighting the union, fighting the parents, instead of actually educating kids.
And all of this just accelerates the exit of the families who are left.
Exactly. Who wants to keep their kid in a school that's closing, merging, striking, and cutting every program? That 65% starts to look like 50%. The death spiral accelerates.
So the system crashes, it hits the wall. But, and here's the reality check. The kids are still there. The state of Washington still has a paramount duty under its constitution to educate them.
They do.
They can't just put up a close sign and go home.
And that leads to the forced restructuring phase. The source argues the state would have literally no other option but to abandon the current delivery mechanism.
The union district building bureaucracy architecture, as they call it.
Right. That whole architecture is simply too expensive for the new revenue reality. So, out of necessity, not ideology, they'd have to switch to a variable cost model.
Explain variable cost model in this context. How is that different?
Think of it like the difference between owning a fleet of taxis versus using Uber.
Okay.
Owning taxis is a fixed cost. You pay for the cars, the maintenance, whether people ride or not. Uber just pays per ride. That's a variable cost. The model suggests the state would have to move to something like vouchers or education savings accounts, ESAs.
Giving the money directly to the parents.
Yes. If the state gives a parent $12,000, says go find education, the state no longer has to worry about the leaking roof or the pension fund or the union contract.
The cost becomes perfectly linear.
One kid, one check. It offloads the entire fixed cost risk onto the market.
It also mentions charterization,
which is essentially handing over the school buildings to private or nonprofit operators who aren't bound by all those legacy debts and contracts.
So the state effectively becomes a funding mechanism rather than an operator of schools.
By necessity. The source argues that if you can't afford your fixed costs, you have to shed them.
It sounds like a total reset, a complete rewrite of the entire rulebook.
The source has a strategic summary that really drives this home. It says something like, one generation of sustained 35% exit on the order of 3 to 5 school years is enough to almost certainly break the system.
One generation, just a freshman class graduating. That is the timeline between status quo and total restructuring.
It shows just how fragile these systems really are, and that's the deeper insight here.
Let's pull back and look at that deeper insight, because this deep dive isn't really just about Washington schools, is it? It's about how we build systems. It's organizational theory.
It's about the difference between a resilient system and a fragile one. A resilient system can breathe. It can scale up, and it can scale down.
Yeah.
If a restaurant loses customers, it's painful, but it doesn't cause a constitutional crisis. It adapts.
Because the restaurant doesn't rely on 100% participation to pay its light bill.
Correct. This model shows that the public education system, and frankly many government monopolies, is rigid. It is highly leveraged on the assumption of the captive audience.
It assumes the customers cannot leave.
It assumes the money will always be there and the bodies will always be in the seats. It builds its debt structures, its pension promises, its labor contracts on that one single guarantee.
And when that guarantee is violated, when the audience proves they aren't captive after all, the rigidity becomes the downfall. The fixed costs become an anchor that drags the whole ship down.
It turns a management problem into an existential threat. And the terrifying part of the model is just how little margin for error there is. We aren't talking about a 90% drop. We're talking about a minority leaving just over a third, triggering a total collapse for the majority who stay.
It's a sobering look at the math behind the bureaucracy. We tend to think of stability as nothing changes. But true stability is the ability to adapt when things change.
And this model suggests our current education architecture lacks that ability completely.
It suggests it is a system built for a world that might not exist anymore, a world where there are no alternatives and no exits.
That's the takeaway.
Well, that is certainly something to chew on. We went from a spreadsheet simulation to a potential constitutional crisis in under 20 minutes. It really changes how you look at that local school bond measure or the next budget hearing.
That's the power of economic modeling, right?
Yeah.
It reveals the cliff before you drive over. It forces you to ask, does the math actually work?
Absolutely. Before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. This model suggests that the current system requires, essentially, 100% compliance to avoid collapse. If a public service requires everyone to participate just to keep the lights on, is it actually a stable public service? Or is it simply a monopoly that has never been stress tested? And as technology and culture provide more and more exit ramps, what happens when that stress test finally arrives?
That is the question.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll catch you on the next one.